It's my, I'm gonna drop all my stuff. It's my total pleasure to be able to moderate a conversation with world-renowned, best-selling author and academic, Todd Rose, my dear friend. Here's what I want to start with, because I know it's hard to not talk about the recent scandals. So let me just sort of start with this. Jerome Karabell, who is the author of The Chosen, which is a book written a couple of years ago. He's a Berkeley professor, retired Berkeley professor, about the admissions process at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And I thought he recently had a quote which I just thought was brilliant. I think his quote was, "I think the bottom line is that what has happened with elite colleges is they've democratized anxiety more effectively than they've democratized opportunity." And I just thought we would open by getting Todd's comment on that statement.
Yeah, well, I agree with it, and it's not. I'll tell you my opinion on this, and then I'll fully appreciate the hypocrisy of me saying this.
Sitting at Harvard?
Yeah, as a professor at Harvard. But as someone who grew up in rural America, my dad was the first high school graduate. There's certain things that bother me, and I think that this issue is like a bigger problem of rather than just having rich people sort of cheating to get their kids in. Because it's funny that like it bothered us that they did it one way, but then if you buy a building and your kid gets in, we think that's just how it works, right? So it's like there's a certain number that it's no longer corrupt. But I think the bigger problem for me is that like the way we've thought about higher education, which is again is this vehicle of opportunity, this great equalizer, is that it's essentially viewed as like a luxury good, right? Like in the sense that scarcity equals quality. And so, it's any one university or college is actually hard, they can't get out of it, right? So like you're judged by how few people you can educate, which is such a weird thing, right? Like not what they do when they're done, not how many people. You could imagine other methods. And so you end up having really a quota system, right? So like my biggest gripe, and I wrote about this in Dark Horse, I was really frustrated with this sense of like, we're trying to have it both ways in universities. We want to pretend we have really high standards, like, oh, it's really hard to get into this school, except for nobody can tell you in advance what it takes. What does it mean to be qualified to get into Harvard? It's after the fact. After we've filled the seats we have, we then tally like what their SAT scores were, and we're like, this is what the incoming group was like. It's like, yeah, that's a quota system, right? It's not, and for me, like, I was a little tongue-in-cheek because what I'd like to see is, look, just tell us in advance what your standards are. If you want to keep a set number of seats, whatever, tell us in advance. What does it mean to be qualified to be there? And then lottery, whoever gets past that threshold goes into a lottery, and then that's it. Like, and the reason I would say this is, first of all, universities are never going to do it because they don't want to give up that control. Right. But the thing I think the most damaging thing that's happened about this kind of system is we start to think that the reason there are so few people at these elite institutions is because talent is limited. But it's not true, right? Like, no. It's actually limited by fiat, right? Like, and so for me, what I think you'd see pretty quickly is just the richness and diversity of the talented youth that we actually have. And then we as a people could have a conversation about, are we okay letting them be tax exempt? If their goal is to educate as few people as possible, I'm not sure the public would be that okay with it, right? Like, so, but I feel like right now it's easy for us to see it as a talent problem rather than the way they've decided to define quality.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about your book, Dark Horse. We actually have a dark horse sitting in the front row. There he is, John Couch, for those who haven't read the book. John's prominently written about in the book. Talk through a little bit of your thesis, what dark horses are. I love how you trace it back to the 1800s. And the sort of subtitle is Achieving Success Through the Pursuit of Fulfillment. Why are dark horses important? And maybe in the age of AI, are we at risk of not having dark horses anymore because talent becomes decipherable earlier or something?
Yeah.
But
so. This whole thing started, so I didn't actually mean to write a book. I actually never have. So I'm like, I have a few books now, and I never really meant to be an author. But my previous book, End of Average, I had written about this shifting, getting away from using aggregate data and thinking of the average person as being meaningful. And in that book, I actually focused on a handful of companies that I thought were dealing with individuality in a very constructive way. Places like Costco, Zoho, and a few others. And one of the things that even though that book profiled the companies, what I kept seeing when I would go there is like these amazing people, right? Not just the leaders, but the people in those organizations, they were really fantastic. And like it kept coming up that there would be like these really interesting, non-traditional backgrounds of how they ended up where they are. You take someone like the head of wine, the buyer for wine for Costco, which is like the most important person in wine in the world, basically. You would imagine that she had this very, very storied kind of like, I'm a master somm, like I've passed all this stuff, right? No, she was a secretary at Costco. Then she was in charge of cassette tapes, and then she was a buyer for tires. And of course, when she became that, they were the field of when like they were so mad, like how could they put? Now it turns out she's amazing and everyone's happy. But what I thought was interesting is, wait a minute, it's one thing for companies to create these environments, but like the individual has to figure out a path, right? How did they get here? So I started digging in. I thought, well, I wonder if like these sort of like non-traditional path stuff, what I would call dark horses, they're just people who are successful you don't see coming, right? Annette Alvarez-Peters, the wine buyer, you did not see her coming, right? Like, you'd not be like, hey, over in tires, there's your next great wine buyer. So, yet here she is, right? So I thought, like, maybe someone studied this. Like, what do we know about these people? And I just couldn't find anything. So we started this dark horse project at Harvard. And I'd never done qualitative research before. I was a pretty, like, just hard quant person. And I'm a convert now in terms of, turns out you can learn a lot by listening to people, surprise. As a reformed academic, I learned that the hard way. But so we just started finding people at all walks of life, went to every professional organization we could and said, look, you must have people who are like exceptional at what they do, but have non-traditional backgrounds, would love to talk to them. And we just started interviewing people, and I just wanted to know, do they have anything in common at all? And I have to say, like, the rest of what I'll say makes me sound really smart. Like I was just flat wrong about what I thought we would see. So I thought you'd have to have I thought it'd be a little bit about personality, right? Like that in a standardized world, you'd have to be that person that kind of, it's like a Steve Jobs. Like you kind of don't mind bucking the system, or Richard Branson, right? Like I think Sir Richard actually gets an enormous amount of joy simply defying what people want him to do, right? So I thought, maybe that's what leads people into their own path, right? And it turned out after the first, 50, 60 people we talked to, the hundreds, like it was clear that wasn't true. Some people had more brash personality, but there were like incredibly shy people, very thoughtful, like just all over the board, right? And what surfaced really, really quickly, like we wanted to talk about how they got good at the thing. Like, how did you master this? How did you get right? What they wanted to talk about is how they figured out who they are and what they cared about. And they kept using words like fulfillment. And I got to be honest, even though I'm a big fan of this, like, or meaning and purpose. And I was like, I don't want that to be the answer. I just, like, what do you do with that, right? Like, it's this squishy thing, and like, ooh, I want to live a fulfilling life, right? Like, but they kept talking about it. So we're like, look, at some point, if this is important, like we've got to dig in. And what I thought was interesting, and what I thought became worthy of like telling people, is that you quickly start listening to them and realize it's not that after the fact they're like, and I feel fulfilled, blah, blah. It's that this was a choice that was made early on about being true to who they are and what success would mean to them, and playing by that, like making choices based on that. And what we found is that they ended up knowing, a handful of things that made that incredibly actionable, not a risky proposition, but a very like secure path to a successful life. And I felt like, especially in an age of personalization, where in theory at least, we have a lot more options at our disposal, like understanding how to take advantage of those things to live the kind of life you want to live was something we could all benefit from.
You're a dark horse.
Yeah. I was curious, yeah.
You want to give the audience just a quick...
Yeah. Okay. So, so I will say, I believe the science we talk about and these sorts like stand on their own. So like, but it is true that like, I think we tend to be interested in things that affect us or our upbringing. Yeah, so like I'm a Harvard professor. I started a think tank. I'm proud of like those kind of achievements, but I also dropped out of high school with a 0.9 GPA, which is kind of awesome, really, if you think about it. Like, because I think the work it takes a lot of work. Like you're like working against even just social promotion, right? Like, and I think, by the way, it's the way you do it, right? Because imagine if you're the person that tried hard and you just barely don't get the grades and you have to leave, right? No, I just bailed. I was like, I had fun. No, I'm just kidding. It's not a good path, but it didn't work. It was a bad fit. I ended up getting married when I was 19. We had 2 kids. By the time we were like 21, 22. Was on welfare, had a string of bunch of minimum wage jobs, and then trying to figure out how you have a better life, which surprisingly to everybody around, including myself, like turned out to involve going to college. Right? And then I ended up at Harvard to do my doctorate. And
that's all she wrote. There's probably a little bridge in there somewhere. But.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could say that like that. In my own life.
I know your parents photoshopped your picture and you were as a football player.
That's right. Yeah. My parents had mortgaged their home, $500,000. There I was in the school. I wish I could say that in my own life, right, which I think that I knew the things that like dark horses knew, the stuff in the book. Like I knew a couple of things, but like until now, if someone would have said, should someone follow your path? Well, no, right, not exactly. But I would have said, like, I don't know, there was enough what felt like luck for me, some really important relationships and things like that matter. But I genuinely believe that, now that I understand this broader dark horse mindset, I feel like it's a safe path, and it's something that I would recommend, including to my own kids, which they never cease to now tell me how I get to parent them. If you've written about it, and they're like, is this really something that'll bring me fulfillment? Is this something just do the dishes? It's not that hard, right?
Okay, can you talk a little bit about some of your recent work, which is not really out fully into the public view, and we talked a little bit on the phone about the personal success index that you're working on, and some of the disconnects between what people say on the outside, in public versus what they believe in private about success. So you can talk a little bit about where you're going with that.
This is the thing I'm most excited about. So in our think tank Populous, like we're really interested in this convergence of like individuality, not as selfishness, but as like the distinctiveness of people that deserves to be valued. What that means for more personalized systems, like how things can go terribly wrong, like how could. And one of the things that we started to look at, which was actually independent of the Dark Horse Project, it was kind of interesting, we realized pretty quickly that how people think about success is a really important why for so much of this. How do you get people to engage in these things? Now, historically in the United States, success has been viewed very comparatively, right? It's literally and there's some people who will say this, I am successful because I am better than you. Well, that's definitely not true, but you're successful because you're better than me.
Yeah, I had a 1.5 GPA.
See, that's almost double, right? You're almost twice as good as me. And so in a world where, as a society, we view success as comparative and as zero sum, right? Somebody has to lose for me to win. That's been the dominant model of success in the United States, at least for most of the industrial age, actually. So it turned out whenever that's your view of success, taking things like individuality and personalization actually leads to more selfishness. It leads people to see it as competitive advantage, and that's it, right? They don't want anybody else to have it. They don't want. So we got interested in understanding where the public really was, and I got to tell you, the most hopeful, kind of cool thing that I can say, and it's not public yet, although I guess you all get to know. So we know for sure after numerous national surveys, we have more data than anybody on this subject, including a bunch of state-level focus groups. A solid 60% of the country rejects this view now. They don't want it. They think it's really bad. They think it's been bad for themselves. If they're parents, they don't want their kids to basically be brought up thinking it only matters how you compare to someone else, and you should see other people's competition, and that's it. And what was really cool is that they're pretty good at articulating the alternative. about how they think about it, and they still want to pay the bills, right? I mean, you can't mess with that. People got to be able to not live in their parents' basement and stuff like that. But they want to achieve, so it's not complacency. But then they talk about things like meaning and purpose and even fulfillment, right? I like that word, but it's sort of interchangeable in this group. And what's really fascinating about this is, well, first of all, we didn't believe it when we first got it, like that. So we did surveys again. We changed how we talk about it. Something has changed.
So you think it's different? I mean, you think there's been a...
So we even asked whether this is something that... Yeah, we asked whether it was, is this always been your view, or has this changed? And like a majority of that new silent majority actually said it's changed for them. And when we asked why, it's either the self-knowledge, like I've discovered more about myself, or actually, like frankly, for a number of people, like the election in 2016, believe it or not, surprisingly in the subset of like Republican women, that was a major driver of like, that's not really what I want my kids to be.
Actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying. I don't mean to be. I don't like. I just. This is what the data told us.
Yeah.
Now, here's what I think is really, really important, as far as we're concerned in the work that we do. So this group, I'll call it the fulfillment group, but again, they have really, really important views about other people that I think are so fabulous. So the zero-sum group, by the way, it still exists. I can't believe anybody, when you ask them, was like, yeah, no, definitely. It's only that I'm better than you. But like 17% of the people say that's their view of success. And first of all, it's only 17%, right? Like when you ask these groups, what percentage of your fellow citizens do you believe are innately capable of being successful in their lifetime? The zero-sum group pegs it at 10%. What's weird is they're not all successful. They don't even know if they'll be part of the 10%. But they're sure it's just 10%. The fulfillment group puts it at 80%. And when we ask why only 10% or why only 80%, the zero-sum group says the reason it's not going to be higher than 10 is because of talent. There's just most people aren't talented. You know what I mean? The fulfillment group said the reason it's only 80% is lack of opportunity. Now, the other thing is related to education. The fulfillment group is overwhelmingly the most frustrated group. There's no way to cut demographics. This group is the most frustrated with public education. They're so, but of course, right? If you want your kid to be equipped to live a meaningful, fulfilling life, the system we have is not doing that, right? The other thing I would say about this group that's I'm excited about is it is completely representative of the United States today, demographically. I worried that it would be a rich person's game. Like once you've got everything else, you're like, oh, I got all my Ferraris and stuff like that. I guess fulfillment, I don't know. Like, it's not. If you're really poor, if you can't pay the bills, you're really laser focused on that. And as someone who was in that place, that's fine, right? But it is actually solidly a working class and middle class shift in this view and what they think about success. There's no way you can cut the data, no demographic cut, no racial, gender, ethnic, anything cut for which a majority of Americans don't hold this new view. And so one of the questions we had, which was like, well, hold on. If 60% of the public in a democracy, in a market economy, had this view, why is this not the public view? Really? Like that was our skeptical, like, come on. So we pushed really hard in subsequent work to figure out like what was going on, and here's what became really clear. When we ask that 60%, what percentage of your fellow citizens do you believe also hold this new view of success? We asked it another way in other surveys. What percentage do you think still want the zero-sum view? Either way you ask it, this fulfillment group believes that they are a 5% minority.
Wow.
Now, if you think about, in this audience right now, you think about your own view of success, what a good life really means to you. I would wager that the majority of you are on this side of fulfillment. Like that's how you would want to think about the life you want to live, and you probably thought you were not a majority as well. Now, here's the problem with that. You're a majority, and we're not acting like a majority, right? And in the field of economics and social theory, there's a thing called preference falsification. It's really important, and it's sort of core to our work at Populous. You're going to need culture on your side if you want to change the purpose of some of these systems, and normally that's impossible to do. Like if public opinion really represented private opinion, you are not changing that. That's like changing someone's religion, just one person at a time. But when there's a gap, like there is right now with success, where what people truly believe and what they're saying out loud isn't the same thing, you can change things in a hurry. And there's plenty of ways to how we do that using social proof. I just need to convince you that it's okay to say what you really believe because you're actually part of a majority. And things can bandwagon in a hurry. So I'm excited about it because most of us have a view that's very inclusive and expansive about each other. We believe in each other. We believe that betting on each other would be beneficial for all of us. We're sick of pitting ourselves against each other unnecessarily. And if we realize that that's what we all want, then it's ours to have, right? Education doesn't have to rank and sort from almost day one, right? It doesn't have to do that. We can have better workplaces, but it's up to us to want that. And so I'm very, very optimistic, excited. We have a number of things that we're coming out with soon, including this success index. We figured out a way to actually measure your subjective view of success and then aggregate it up and show what does it mean for each of us to want to live a fulfilling life.
Yeah, so maybe in perverse ways, the 2016 election created an important tipping point to sort of lay bare this disconnect between the public and private view. And this is the silent majority that you're talking about. And when you talk about the silent majority, you say it has there's a frightening element for democracy.
Yeah.
Take it a little further. I mean, what can we do? Is transparency the answer? I mean, what can we do to make the public reality match the private reality?
So most of the models and the things, and so we have a number of things we're doing, including it's basically like social proof, right? At the end of the day, every time you want to state a public opinion, it's both what you care about and then there's some reputational cost or reward to saying something out loud, right? And that's usually how people decide their public opinion. And that's true when you ask people about voting in advance of an election. Like, what do I tell the person in case, versus what I'll do in the voting booth.
Right.
And so the biggest thing is it's like, so we have stuff like we're starting to insert this language into TV shows, into the movies we watch, right? So you start to see it in the surround. Like, this is how people talk about things. I think the success index we're coming out with Gallup in September will show this at a pretty large scale. We have plans to do the global index in 2020 with 140 countries to start looking about, like, this is what people mean by success. I think the danger of not doing this, like in the field of preference falsification, it's so toxic to democracies because you end up with policies and things in place that aren't good for people, that nobody really wants, but they stick around, right? Because public opinion is what matters. And so we think that most of our work is going to be, how do you socialize this changed view of success? I'm not interested in changing people's minds. I really don't. Like, if you're in that 17%, that's your view. That's okay, right? But let's have an open conversation about what we, the people, actually want, and then what that means for our public institutions.
Okay, let's go back to education. This is, after all, a education and talent conference, and you epitomize education and talent. You argue, compellingly that standardization was appropriate at a certain time in the country's history or the world's history, and now is killing us as it applies to education. It's certainly the most standardized system we've got. You also talk about people don't want more education; they want different education, and policymakers are just pushing on the more part, not the different part. So, talk about that and how do we get out of this box to create systems that are actually reflective of what the people want and what's going to help us bend the arc of human potential.
So our sneak peek of, just for you all, in this new personal success index, that we're able to get this like subjective view for you, we also figure out how you're doing at these things, right? So in our view, success is if you have a certain pattern, and then it's like, am I able to strive toward those things? Am I making progress? Then you'll feel successful, and we count that. That's great, right? It doesn't matter what we think you should care about. And then when gaps open up, we would think this might be a problem. And what we find so far is when people have gaps in the things they care about versus strive toward, they become very frustrated and disillusioned with public systems, not surprisingly. And when you start seeing patterns of gaps, right, then that becomes a policy issue and things. So one of the things that so far that has been so surprising to us in the data we have is that the biggest gaps aren't in like education. So for example, to your point, like people aren't like, oh, if only I could have more. It's just they don't feel like what they're getting is actually connecting them to the things they really want to do, right? Interestingly enough, the people that are most satisfied with their education are people that get credentials. And the least satisfied right now are people with 4-year degrees. Now, we have reasons to wonder whether that's because it's so expensive and they're burdened with cost versus, but we haven't disentangled that yet. But I'll tell you the thing that was the most surprising thing to me, I guess I don't know why it was, but I was just really surprised, is the role of belonging in people's view of success. So not only is it like profoundly important, like I get that like relationships and this would matter. I just didn't know when we asked people what their most aspirational views of their life are, that belonging would be so fundamental. It's also the biggest gap that we see in the data between people, what they want, and they feel like they're failing. Most people feel like they can't, they're not able to connect. And I think it's the breakdown of our civic society, these community organizations. I think religion played a really important role there, and it's sort of receded a bit. And I think that, and what's really frightening to us is that in every other domain of success, education, work, things, when there are gaps, people know who to sort of blame. They know why this. If you feel like education's your problem, you know who to blame, right? Not with belonging. Nobody really knows whose responsibility it is, right? So on the side of the education thing, though, like I do think, and I will say, we have to be really thoughtful about this, right? Because more personalized systems definitely have the power to be incredibly equitable, incredibly fair, better at developing more talent. But it's not guaranteed, right? Like it's not baked into personalization that it will be better and fairer, right? That has to be something we are intentional about. But I do think, look, at the end of the day, this very narrow, like everybody has to go through this narrow gate and has to go not only to college, but the best college possible, even to then have a chance at a very, very diverse economy is kind of nonsensical, right? But I do think that there's plenty of cool stuff. I think they end up on the side. I think ASU has done really remarkable things, right? I thought it was so funny in the college admission schedule that they got on record. Yes. What is my daughter going to go to ASU? We got to stop that. Like let's spend the $500,000 so she can go to like, you know.
Michael Crow was quite funny on his panel on Monday talking about the about that.
Well, I was on Dr. Drew and he was like, yeah, this. I'm like, the real answer should have been, yeah, go to ASU.
Right.
They got some really great stuff. So it's like there's a little bit of a disconnect there, but yeah.
Talk a little bit about, certainly artificial intelligence has been a big theme here. Of course, it's a big theme. You can't pick up any periodical, any piece of media today, not hear about artificial intelligence. Talk a little bit about, the role of artificial intelligence, its dangers, how you see its potential, and it certainly can aid in the personalization, addressing personalization, but, give us a little your view.
There's two terrifying things about it.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of upside. Two things that really, really trouble me. One is this AI is only as good as the assumptions we put into it. So if you bake in a view of limited talent, a bell curve is built in. If you want to bake in types, things, just like we get it with gender and racial bias when you build it in, right? Even if it's not intentional, you can get it. What worries me about that is this becomes that on steroids, and there's a general perception in the public that these things are so smart, right? Rather than, no, like it's just an assumptions engine, right? Like so we have to be thoughtful about that. We don't, in my case too, like that we don't just put a bunch of standardization in and then like really frog march everyone to like the worst possible outcomes for themselves. The second thing though, that I think is not even more, but like equally problematic for me is who gets this knowledge? Who gets to decide? Because there's a lot of incentive. Right now, the systems are actually getting this information. I mean, it's a little terrifying that like most systems know you better than you know yourself. And what's interesting is when I think of something like, if I go to Amazon, I know that's what we tend to use these as go-to examples, or even Facebook. These have like, 100 dimensions of you as a consumer, like this. Like, and meanwhile, we're left with like, I'm a type A person. You're like, I mean, kind of, right? Like, you're not going to win that fight, right? It's not for nothing that like all these systems have gotten way past average-based standard things and realized they have to treat you as an individual and build models from there. And they're doing it because it's the best way. It works, right? So I worry a little bit that we will not give us the knowledge so we understand how to interact with these systems so that they can be empowering. Because the truth is what will happen is they'll just become manipulative, right? And it's one thing like to be manipulated into buying a book I didn't want, right? But it's another thing when I'm in school and I'm an impressionable mind and I'm being told not only what to learn, but how to think about that thing. And at least in standardization, you kind of knew when that was happening. It's so blunt. You know you're being manipulated. This, I think, it'll happen, and you'll thank them for it, and you'll call it personalization. So I feel like it's really important that we, the people, get this knowledge, and that there's transparency in how these things work, so that we can play the role we need to play in it.
Let's talk about passion. That's one of my favorite sections of Dark Horse. And you say dark horses, for dark horses, passion is a blowtorch. I love that too, love that quote. And that personalized passion is a wellspring of personal authenticity.
Yeah, so passion is I have mixed feelings about the word. And actually, we have our own public research on this. Like, people love it at first, and then even the people that love it, as they keep going, they're like, it's probably not like lasting, right? And so what I think I've learned the most from dark horses, right, is the first thing they figure out is what motivates them. And I know that seems so unbelievably obvious. Unbelievably obvious. Except for you think about it, like, first of all, in education, we spend almost no time helping kids figure this out. And when we do, we often, as academics, we race to figure out what are the universal motives, the things that we all are motivated by. And we argue over which 1, 2, 3 of them they are. The thing that was so cool about dark horses is we call it micro motives because they were, first of all, they had an incredibly detailed understanding what truly motivated them. And it was such an eclectic range of things. Like stuff that that can't be true, right? I kind of have a sense of what motivates me. Like, there are people you could think like competition. Okay, maybe that motivates some people. But what about like aligning physical objects with your hands? That barely registers. Why would anyone call that a motive? But we talked to a guy who literally, it is like as close to a passion as this person has. And he had other ones, but then he ends up channeling that into being an engineer where he solved this really cool problem of conversion between copper wires and fiber optics back in the day. And like he went from there to being, no kidding, like the top upholstery repair person in New York, which I didn't quite know what that was. It's old family heirlooms and leather, and it's hard. And you would never put those two. You're an engineer and now you're an upholstery repair person. But they actually have deep commonalities in terms of the motives and the things. But so this idea of knowing what motivates you, because you can be successful about it, you won't be fulfilled, right? The ability to achieve things that matter to you means you have to know what matters to you. And it doesn't matter at all if nobody else cares. It doesn't, right? And so the ability to start there and then make choices off of that. And to me, when I think of passion, I think of it as when you find an external activity where you're aligned with a bunch of your motives, you will feel passion, right? And the reason I think it's important to start from the motive standpoint is, I would say I'm passionate about basketball, NBA basketball. If I don't ask myself why, if I don't understand what it is about basketball that I actually enjoy, there will come a time maybe where I don't feel the same passion for it. And then I'm kind of stuck, and then I have a midlife crisis or whatever, what we do, when that happens. And instead, what you see is once you know that the why part of this, your own motives, you can easily, it's portable, right? I can say, okay, this is no longer passionate to me, but I can make better choices. I can find other fits that allow that to continue to happen. The other thing is I think a lot of times with passion, we tend to pick the one white hot thing. But what dark horses did, it's like the range of them, right? Because that way, any one that's extinguished, like this is no longer interesting to me, you still have 7 or 8 things still being activated that keeps it very, very meaningful to you.
Talk about fit, because that's a critical concept in your work.
Yeah, so I think that the idea of, I even think about this in terms of opportunity, right? We tend to think of it as access to the same thing. That's part of it. If you don't have access, you don't have any opportunity. But if you think about it from a personalization standpoint and a fulfillment standpoint, it's really about finding the best fit between who you are as an individual and that environment, right? That also should seem obvious, but then you think about the way we think about who we are. We have such narrow ways of seeing ourselves that it's very hard to make those nuanced choices. I even think about it in the workplace, the Peter principle of we all get promoted to our level of incompetence, right?
I love the Peter principle.
If you knew who you were, you're like, I love being a CFO. Not me, I don't. I would hate to be a CFO, but you're not, you would know better Like I'm not taking that next step no matter what the career ladder is, because it's not going to be a good fit. I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm not going to care about it. But I think we get trapped into that kind of like, this is what's next. This is how we do. My dad is an engineer. He's got probably the most patents on airbags of anybody. And he said at his work, here he is. I'll brag about him. I mean, he single-handedly kept auto leave. He kept them from having the crisis that the other airbag manufacturer did by not allowing them to use what caused it to explode on everyone. His only progress to make more money was to become a middle manager if he wanted. He's the best engineer they have, and you don't have other paths for engineer development. I think companies are figuring this out, that you can't just force everyone into management and then find out that they're not good at it. But
it was good. I had to recently lay somebody off, and I used the fit excuse, having been inspired by your books. It just doesn't fit.
It's not a good fit. Read Todd's book on why you don't have a job
exactly.
anymore.
I'll give you this book. Go home. We'll take care of it. It's just not a good fit. So we're getting down the final minutes here, but talk about excellence and its correlation or not to fulfillment, because I know this is also...
Yeah. So what I think the sort of thesis of Dark Horse is, and the Dark Horse Project, is that we've kind of flipped the relationship between excellence and fulfillment in the past, which is we think if we pursue excellence, right, this sort of standardized thing, that fulfillment or happiness comes afterwards somehow, right? And we all know plenty of people who are very, very, very good at what they do and miserable people, right? And the thing is I think if Dark Horses teach us anything, it is that this relationship is flipped. That what you see is when you know who you are and when you are making decisions based on what will maximize fulfillment. And that doesn't mean do whatever you want, doesn't mean avoid responsibility, but every time in any day you have a choice. There's always a choice. And those choices are almost never equal in terms of what is likely to be more fulfilling to you. When you live your life pursuing those things, what we see is excellence follows. Right? It kind of makes a ton of sense, right? Like if you think about if you're making choices based on fulfillment, it's not surprising that you're much more likely to be engaged in what you do. And I don't think anybody would disagree that someone who's engaged in what they do is better than someone who's not engaged. Like the same person, you want someone engaged. And yet in our country, we have, according to Gallup and others, a majority of us are disengaged in our work. We have a majority of our workforce is disengaged, and you go into school and a majority of our kids are disengaged. Like the worst part about school is you're never more engaged than when you're in kindergarten. Every year you're in our standardized education system, your engagement level declines. Like what in the world, right? Like how is this a thing? So I think the ability to know who you are and have our kids know who they really are, that it's okay, that it's important to take that seriously, to be able to make decisions based on that, especially in a more personalized world that's coming. I think this is what prepares kids to actually thrive. And I think probably the worst thing we could do for our kids is teach them to play by the same old rules, be the same as everyone else, only better, and then hope you can just play through in your jobs. It's not going to work.
So it's really infusing curriculum with social emotional learning.
And self-knowledge. And like it's not the way things have been done. Like I'll get it. Like there was a reason we standardized things, because it was, did you want public education for everyone or personalized education for a few people? So back 100 years ago, I would have been all for that too. But that's not the world we live in, and we have an opportunity. If we use personalization the right way, it is to enable and empower kids, is to build better relationships between the adults in the room and kids, so that kids come out like prepared for an economy, but also prepared by knowing who they are and know what matters to them to live fulfilling lives. That's
great. Well, with that, we are down to our last minute, so I think thank you so much for this session, and go buy Dark Horse. Actually, The End of Average is also one of my favorites, Todd's previous book, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome.